My name's Jon Carpenter. I'm a member of the board of directors down at Historic Elk Landing. I function as our unit historian down at Elk Landing. How many of you have been down to Elk Landing to visit us? Okay. Everybody pretty familiar with the history of it. What we are is a living history museum. We're situated about 60 acres of land that owned by the town of Elkton on long-term lease to the Historic Elk Landing Foundation. We are a nonprofit living history museum. And tonight's presentation, I want to talk mostly about the period around the American Revolutionary War, since we're following the George Washington theme here. We have an awful lot of history at Elk Landing. We have a tremendous amount of War of 1812 history, social history, trade, political history. But tonight I'm going to concentrate on the period up to and including the Revolutionary War. So Elk Landing is located at the confluence of Big Elk Creek and Little Elk Creek, 580 Landing Lane. We'll begin our presentation talking about the prehistory of the site. Prior to European contact, the area along the Elk Creeks was used by Native Americans. Most of the Native Americans in this area were not large tribes. They were small bands, mostly subgroups of the Lenape or Delaware Indian tribe. They spoke an Algonquin language. This was totally different from the Indians on the other side of the county, which were Susquehannocks, which were an Iroquoian people that spoke the Iroquoian language. And they also had a very, very important piece of technology that made them particularly effective in warfare, and that was the Iroquois knew how to make canoes out of birch bark, which were lighter and faster than the dugout wooden canoes used by the rest of the tribes here. According to our archaeological data and digs on the site, we found some Native American remains. It doesn't appear that there was a full village here, but there were rather semi-permanent settlements, and the Indians would follow. For example, when the anadromous fish came in to spawn in the spring, they would come down to the Elk Creeks and catch fish. And then they would move following the game around. So it didn't appear to be a permanent settlement site, but was used by Native Americans for a long period of time prior to European contact. In 1608, Captain John Smith explored the upper Chesapeake Bay. He came up and discovered these rivers at the head of the bay. He named the Sassafras River Tuckwa, after the Tuckwa Indians that were over there. He explored Elk Marsh, and there are two stories about how the Elk River and Elk Marsh got its name. One is that he sighted large herds of elk along the banks of the creek. Most of the historians tended to dismiss that story, and they believe the other story, which is when he got into the narrow, windy stream channels, the dendritic pattern of the stream channels up in the marsh reminded him of an elk's antler. In fact, that's how we get the name, the town of Head of Elk, because those stream channels look like an elk's antler. And also, this was the head of navigation. Why would this area be a good place to plant a settlement? Anybody think? Why is the town of Elkton here? Why not? Why is it 10 miles inland or 6 miles east?
On the water.
Right, very good. The three strategic important locations are three strategic considerations. Number one is we're situated at the head of navigation on the Chesapeake Bay. This is as high up as you can get on the waters of the Chesapeake Bay with an ocean-going ship. Now, when I say ocean-going ship, I'm talking about a small trading vessel, maybe 60 to 70 feet in length, maybe 6 feet deep in the hold. You're not going to get a warship like the USS Constellation or Constitution up this narrow stream channel. But he had 6 or 8 feet of water out there. It was plenty to get a trading vessel up here. It was located on the shortest land route across the Delmarva Peninsula. So if you were moving trade goods or people, say from Philadelphia to Baltimore, this was right on the way. Remember, the CMD Canal wasn't dug until the late 1820s. So before that, you had to transship goods by land across the Delmarva Peninsula. Also, it's in close proximity to the fall line. Anybody know what the fall line is? What is fall line? Somebody raise their hand?
What's the water on the
Right. It's where the crystalline rocks of the Piedmont Plateau meet the sandy sediments of the Atlantic coastal plain. And it's typically an area where you get falling water where the two meet. For example, Baltimore is located on the fall line of the Tapsco River. Trenton, New Jersey is located on the fall line of the Delaware River. And the Richmond, Virginia is located on the fall line of the James River. All those three cities were as high up as a person could get navigable water, and then you hit the falling water. And what does the falling water do for you? What does running water do for you in colonial times?
Power.
Exactly. Important source of power. What are you going to power with that running water?
Grist mills.
Grist mills, right? Sawmills, up and down sawmills, grinding mills, bark mills. Any time you need any kind of power, the fall line provided important sources of power. So that's why the community is here. And Elk Landing is situated almost on the fall line on Little Elk Creek. You go about 200 yards up the creek and you run out of water in a hurry. Coming up Big Elk Creek into town, you still have pretty good water in colonial times. But this made a wonderful, wonderful place to build a settlement. So throughout the 17th century, the area was gradually settled. There were groups of Swedes and Finns that came over west from the east, from New Sweden and Delaware. One important man who came to this area was named Jon Hansen Steelman. Mr. Steelman had been born in New Sweden. He grew up to be a trader. He traded with the Native American tribes. He spoke the Lenape, or Delaware Indian language, which made him very, very valuable to the politicians, particularly to Lord Baltimore in his negotiations with the Native Americans. Lord Baltimore awarded Mr. Steelman a grant of land and also granted him citizenship in the state of Maryland in 1693. Steelman opened up a trading post near the forks of the two Elk Creeks. We're not exactly sure where, but he opened up a trading post, and there was supposedly a small settlement there named Transtown, small settlement of Swedes and Finns. We have not found any archaeological data on the site or evidence to support and say the Smoking Gun, this is actually the site. But the reports of the settlement of Transtown being located at the forks of the Elk Creek. Mr. Steelman opened up a trading post. He followed the Indians, the Native Americans, as they're being displaced north and west. He goes up to Pequot Creek, in what's now Pennsylvania. He helps the first group of Mennonites get settled, coming over from Europe. And then he follows the Native Americans further west across the Susquehanna River, and there is a historical marker in Adams County, Pennsylvania, not far from Gettysburg, honoring Mr. Steelman as the first European settler west of the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, which made sense. He lived a long, long life. Eventually moved back with his family to Wilmington area, and there is a stained glass window in the old Swedish church in Wilmington in his honor. And it appears that even after he moved up in Pennsylvania, he was still maintaining his supply line through Head of Elk here. The properties then become large land grants. There are two large land grants where Elk Landing is now. One was called Price's Venture, the other was called Successor. And in 1705, the land is purchased by the Hollingsworth family and remains in the Hollingsworth family from that period, in their family and their descendants, till the town of Elkton purchased it and we established the Elk Landing Museum. Valentine Hollingsworth, the first generation came over, was treasurer to William Penn. His grandson, Henry, moved here to Elkton. They were originally Quakers. When they got here to Elkton, there was no Quaker meeting and they converted to become Anglicans. They are mercantilists. The Hollingsworth family were traders and merchants. They established a very, very good trading system based here at Elk Landing with brothers in Philadelphia and brothers in Baltimore, and they were moving goods up and down from Philadelphia to Baltimore Center, and they were also trading into the Caribbean. They were connected with the Archer and Stump families over in Harford County and in Perryville. On the Susquehanna River, the Lapidum Trading Company. So they were trading into the Caribbean. So they're shipping goods, flour, barrel staves, lumber, down into the Caribbean and getting molasses, sugar, tropical fruits, that kind of thing in return. Prior to the Revolutionary War, the real center of commerce here in Cecil County is Charlestown. Does anybody know why Charlestown would be the center of commerce in colonial days? It's because that's where the tobacco and flour inspection warehouses were. By British colonial law, all flour, all tobacco had to be graded and taxes paid on it and stamped at a central location. That location was in Charlestown. So the Hollingsworth family naturally followed the business over there. They opened up the Indian Queen Tavern, which still stands. I believe they also owned the Red Lion Tavern, which is next door. There was also, in Charleston, was the site of the only documented rum distillery in the Chesapeake region. So some of that molasses that was coming up from, and sugar coming up from the West Indies was being distilled right here in Cecil County. Well, what are some of the reasons for the Revolutionary War? Anybody remember why did we fight the British? What about taxes? Right. What kind of things did the British tax? Tea? That's the one we all remember, right? The Boston Tea Party. The Stamp Act, right. The Stamp Act required stamps to be put on all official business papers. Writing, they put tax on writing paper. Right? So if you're a merchant, like the Hollingsworths, what are you using a lot of? Paper and taxable items, right? So when the Revolutionary War breaks out, the Hollingsworths become patriots, not surprisingly given their background as merchants, because the taxes were directly affecting them. Here in Elkton, there were a whole generation of Hollingsworths. Zebulon Hollingsworth Jr. owned Elk Landing, where the museum is. His brother Jacob Hollingsworth owned the tavern, which I have a photograph of here in a minute, which is now Mr. Litzenberg's building across Main Street from American Home and Hardware. They have brother Samuel in Baltimore. They have brother Levi up in Philadelphia, who's a major, major flour merchant out there. So they have a big business up and down the East Coast. So if you were traveling, say, from Philadelphia to Baltimore, you would get on one of their schooners in Philadelphia. You would descend the Delaware River. Most people would have gotten off in Newcastle, but the Hollingsworths found that they could cut several miles off the land transit route across the peninsula by using the Christiana River. So they built a facility just like Elk Landing over behind where Christiana Mall is there. The village up is called Christiana Bridge, and the buildings still stand there. You can go and see them today. So that allowed them to get the boats further up the river and cut the transit across the peninsula almost in half. So you would have gone to head of Christiana, switched to a wagon or a post chaise or a stagecoach, come over to Elk Landing here. You could have gotten a meal at the tavern here, gotten on a schooner and gone down to Baltimore, and vice versa. And we have records at the museum of the shipping going up and down the East Coast. Most of our records are a little later, they're about 1800 or so. But you just see all the iron and lumber, salted herring, going through up here in Elkton area. It is really amazing to see those records. So when the Revolutionary War breaks out, Zebulon Hollingsworth is a merchant. His brother Henry Hollingsworth is the lieutenant colonel of the Cecil County Militia. At the time of the Revolutionary War, all free men, males between the ages of 16 to 45 were expected to be in the county militia. This system was brought over from England. It worked very well in England. We would have been drilled a minimum of 4 times a year quarterly. We would have elected our own company grade officers, captains and below. The field grade officers would have been appointed by the governor and his council. We would have been called out to suppress not only invasion by foreign armies, but also in threat of Native American attacks or civil unrest. So Colonel Hollingsworth was a colonel in the Cecil militia, which was divided into 3 battalions along the Susquehanna River, the Elk River, and the Sassafras River. They called them the Sassafras Battalion, the Elk Battalion, and the Susquehanna Battalion. So, the war breaks out. The first combat during the Revolutionary War was, of course, up in the Boston area. 1775, right? Conquered Lexington, Bunker Hill. 1776, the theater of operations moves further south, the Battle of Long Island, that area. Christmas night, 1776, Washington crosses the Delaware, launches the attack on Trenton, New Jersey. Fights the British again, steals a march on them, fights them again at Princeton, and the British withdraw to northern New Jersey. After that fighting, things got very, very partisan in New Jersey, extremely partisan. You had Tory militia supporting the British, Whig militia supporting the Americans, out fighting each other. It was known as the Forage War because they were going out trying to actually get fodder for the horses, which was a short supply. But things got very, very nasty. The British commander in North America at this time is Sir William Howe. William Howe was very, very popular with his troops and very popular with his officers. He was known to be a bit of a party animal, loved the women, loved his drink, looked out for his men, was very popular in his time. And he came up with a plan to defeat the Americans. Where's the American capital?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, exactly. Howe's plan is to get as many of his troops together as possible and load them on ships, come around Cape May, ascend the Delaware River, and take the American capital at Philadelphia. To help him is his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe. Howe assembled a fleet of 265 British ships. This was the largest assembly of British ships since the time Sir Francis Drake fought off the Spanish Armada. Now, the British are located in New York at this time, so they embark from Sandy Hook, New Jersey. At the same time, there's another British army coming down from Canada, down the Hudson River, led by General John Burgoyne. His strategy is to gain control of the Hudson River and literally split the colonies in half, isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, thinking that they had more support down here in the South and it would be easier to pacify the population. So the British load up the entire British army, the Hessian mercenaries, the horses, and he sets out from Sandy Hook, New Jersey, to come around Cape May. The Americans got wind of this, where he might be going, and they took the precaution of sinking vessels in the channel of the Delaware River below Philadelphia and building a fort on each side of the river. Fort Mifflin on the Pennsylvania side, which still stands, located right above Philadelphia International Airport today, and Fort Mercer on the New Jersey side. The British load up and they disappear over the horizon. They're gone. Where did they go? This was a question that George Washington was faced with. What should he do with the army? He's still up north. Where can he position the army to best defend? He doesn't know where Howe's going. Is Howe coming around to take Philadelphia? Or is Howe going to double back and go up the Hudson River to reinforce Burgoyne? Washington doesn't know. So as a precaution, he moves the army down around Wilmington, Delaware. So the British get down, they're warned of this fortification on the Delaware River. So they make the decision, the Howe brothers make the decision, instead of landing in Delaware River, to come all the way around the Virginia Capes and come right here to Cecil County at the head of the bay. Problem was, they were hit with a violent storm, almost a hurricane, scattered the whole fleet. So what was supposed to be a week-long voyage turned into 6 weeks. They don't arrive up here in the Elk River until August 24th of 1777. By that time, They had about 350 horses when they started. About half the horses had died. The men are seasick. They just want to get off those vessels. So beginning at 3 a.m. on the 25th of 1777, the British began to offload their troops. They have about 17,000 troops in 3 divisions. And there's Washington himself. He'd say he's very perplexed at this move. Now, when the British show up, now he knows where they are. They send riders and couriers up to Washington. Washington, accompanied by General Lafayette and General Nathaniel Greene, ascend first Iron Hill over in Delaware, and then Gray's Hill just east of Elkton, and watch the British operations. They're very confused because normally the British have a very, very organized system of getting people off the boats and camps and laid out their camps. Everything's, the tents are all straight. But they didn't do that. They didn't even set up their camping equipment. The men basically got their sea legs, tried to get their land legs back rather. They're still seasick. All they want to do is just get on dry land and get something to eat. So Washington watches.
Get all the way up to the land? For the large vessels, get all the way
Good
up?
question. It's best from all the records, the actual landing site was about where Hearts Chapel United Methodist Church is down the Elk Neck Peninsula. Because you remember, you got to put 256 ships down there, right? Or 265 ships rather. It's huge. And some of the records I was looking at last night indicated that the British ships ran aground, quite a number ran aground on the mud, but not seriously enough that they were beached, they could get off. But they need a wide area to fit that many ships, so they couldn't come all the way up the narrow creek. It's not even deep enough for most of the majority of the fleet's anchored, down off Turkey Point, and up to Hearts Chapel, that area, what is Hearts Chapel now. So they offload there. And Howe divides his force into 3 divisions. General Charles Cornwallis goes into Elkton, the town of Elkton, what was then called Head of Elk, with his division, which included the 71st Regiment of Foot. The Hessians under Baron von Niethausen and the British General Charles Grey are kept to ferry across to the south side of the Elk River, and then General Grant, with the 3rd Column, is left to secure the landing point. So Washington now has a debate. What do you do? What do you do if you're George Washington and you're facing 17,000 well-trained British troops? What's your strategy? Very good. What Washington does is realize he can't effectively set a line of defense this far south. He's got to get things organized further north. So what he does is he calls out the Cecil County militia. There are not many of us at that point. Well, maybe 50 of us at that point would be able to show up in a hurry. But he does call out the Delaware militia. And the descriptions of the Delaware militia, particularly of the upper 2 counties of Newcastle and Kent, they did not call out the Sussex County militia because in southern Delaware there were a large number of Tories, and they were afraid of depopulating the defense force of the lower county, figuring the British Tories sympathizers would take over. But the descriptions are that the Delaware militia was very, very well equipped, better than the Continental Army at that point. So Washington realizes, I can't stop the British, but I can slow them down a bit. So he detaches the militia over here. And when he gets up on top of Gray's Hill, he looks at it and he's confused. There's a quote from Washington. They, remaining where they disembarked at first, I could not find out from inquiry what numbers landed, nor from an estimate, form an estimate for the distant view of their encampment. In other words, the British are so disorganized, he's not able to count the number of troops and get a good estimate. And that's one of the things that confused him, is how large a force am I in fact facing? General Howe thought that he could pacify the local population. Due to his experience in the Forge War the previous year, he decided on a strategy similar to what we tried to use in Vietnam many years later, that is, to win the hearts and minds of the population. And he brought a printing press with him. And he published the following proclamation. Sir William Howe, regarding the calamities to which of many of His Majesty's subjects are still exposed to by the continuance of the rebellion, and no less desirous of protecting the innocent than determined to pursue with the rigors of war all those whom His Majesty's forces, in the course of their progress, may find in arms against the King, doth hereby assure the inhabitants of the province of Delaware and the counties of Maryland on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, that in order to remove any groundless apprehension which may have been raised by their suffering by the depredation of the army under his command, has issued the strictest orders to his troops for the preservation of the regularity of good discipline, and has signaled that the most exemplary punishment shall be inflicted upon those who dare to plunder the property or molest the persons of any of His Majesty's well-disposed subjects. Security and protection are likewise extended to all persons, inhabitants of the provinces and counties aforesaid, who, not guilty of having assumed legislative or judicial authority, may have acted illegally in subordinate station, and, conscious of their misconduct, being induced to leave their dwelling, provided that such persons do forthwith return and remain peaceable at their usual places of abode. Considering, moreover, that many officers and private men, now actually in arms against His Majesty, may be willing to relinquish the part they have taken in the rebellion, and return to their due allegiance. Sir William Howe doth therefore promise a free and general pardon to all such officers and private men as shall voluntarily come and surrender themselves to any detachment of His Majesty's forces before the day on which it shall be notified that such indulgences is to be discontinued.
Like one sentence a day.
Yeah, flowery language. But basically, Howe was under the impression that if he treated people well, he could win their hearts and minds. It did not work. No. His soldiers were in such bad condition that they immediately started plundering and raiding and foraging. Particularly, there was a shortage of fodder for the horses. The horses suffered terribly on this voyage. And things fall apart very quickly for the British as far as discipline goes. There are descriptions of a British soldier capturing a young woman and cutting off her finger for the ring. There are at least 2 documented executions by the British of their own troops for plundering. There's a legend, I don't know if you've heard about anybody heard about the Hessian hold down at Welsh Point? There's a legend that about a dozen Hessians were caught stealing, and the Prussians and the Hessians were very, very harsh in their discipline. And General Kniphausen had them executed and buried in a mass grave that's known as the Hessian Hole down on Welsh Point. I've never been able to find actual documentation on the military records of that, as opposed to the British that executed at least 2 of their own troops. But things don't go well for the British. So when they invest the town of Head of Elk, General Howe sets up his headquarters at the Elk Tavern, also known as Hollingsworth Tavern. That's the building directly across Main Street from American Home and Hardware, still standing. The British have a habit, and Washington has a habit about using taverns for headquarters. I've noticed from the records there. I don't know whether he kind of balked at disposing private people of their houses, or whether he just wanted to take advantage of the goods in the tavern, but the taverns are quite often used for headquarters for military people. Now, not everybody in town is a friendly patriot. This is the Hermitage over on the east side of Elkton. Building still stands. This was owned by Robert Alexander. Robert Alexander was a leading citizen of Maryland. He was a lawyer, practiced in Baltimore for a long time. Owned a home up here in Head of Elk. He was also a delegate to the First Continental Congress. He knew Washington personally. So when Washington comes to reconnoiter, he pays a visit on Mr. Alexander. 3 days later, General Howe pays a complimentary call to Mr. Alexander to visit him. Alexander has to make a choice of which side he wants to go with. He chooses the British. He's a loyalist. His wife said, no, I'm a patriot. He went with the British, moved with the London. They never reconciled, the husband and wife. He moved to England after the war. The American Continental government here through the province of Maryland, which would become the state of Maryland, seizes his property. 2/3 of it is sold off. The other third, including the house, is given to his wife, Ms. Alexander. In our book collection at Elk Landing, we have several books with Mr. Alexander's name and the nameplate up front, which is interesting because guess who was in charge of disposing of the confiscated Tory property here in Cecil County? A committee headed by the Hollingsworths. So chances are that they got that book. I can picture it now. It's a book of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire down there from Robert Alexander. So really interesting. He was major landowner, owned most of the land that most of the town sits on right now. Another interesting story is that when Washington and Lafayette and Nathaniel Greene were up on top of the hill, of the Grays Hill east of town, there was a tremendous thunderstorm that came up, and they took refuge in a farmhouse. Well, the farmhouse turned out to be owned by a loyalist, and they were narrowly avoided capture by a patrol of British dragoons. That storm was particularly vicious. There are records of the British records saying that they lost 15,000 musket cartridges spoiled by the storm due to dampness. The Americans about a single amount. Washington realizes that the head of Elk is an important commissary point, and he writes to Congress saying that, with some satisfaction, saying that he was able to save the salt. And salt's very important to the Continental Army because that's how we preserve meat. So he was able to get the salt out before the British got it. He got everything out by about 7,000 bushels of corn. And then according to the British record, they take that corn, use most of it, and they dig a ditch and they bury the rest of it for future consumption. I don't know whatever became of it, but there's that record of the corn. So all through the British investment of Elkton here, they're sending out patrols, there's fighting going on, minor skirmishes back and forth. Anybody read George Johnson's History of Cecil County? George Johnson tells the story of his, I believe it was his uncle, who was a soldier in the army here, who up at Ricketts Mill, at the house up there, spied a party of British officers in the garden, took a pot shot at one, and then fled. And the next day he came back and found a freshly dug grave. He assumed that the officer he shot at had been killed. The community that's now known as Elk Mills was called Elk Forge, or sometimes referred to as Irontown. There was some fighting going on there. And then General Howe takes the Hessians across to Courthouse Point, which is on the south side of the river here. And they're accompanied by General Charles Gray, who is an extremely aggressive officer. Gray will later become infamous for what is known as the Paoli Massacre around Philadelphia, where he ordered a night attack on American troops. And he ordered them, in order not to alarm anybody, have a premature detonation, he removed all of his troops to remove the flints from their muskets and only used bayonets, and they attacked the American army at night, and it was a pretty one-sided affair. He gained the nickname No Flint Gray. So Gray goes across with orders to advance about a mile in front of the courthouse. And then the next day they proceed over to Cecil Church, which is St. Augustine's Episcopal Church now. There they have an encounter with the Delaware militia who had come west. They captured 2 sets of colors, 2 regimental flags that were left in the church. And I've always wondered whatever happened to them. That would be a great historic find if they're over in England somewhere in a museum. So from there, the British column and the German columns meet at Aiken's Tavern. which is where People's Plaza is right now. On their way over, von Niephausen sent his troops down here to the Bohemia River. And I just read to you General Howe's promise of good conduct. Well, there's a journal entry from a British sergeant named Sullivan. And Sullivan said that when Niephausen's troops got back from their little raid down county, they brought with them, they had captured, where is it here? They had captured 100 horses, 458 sheep, and 265 cattle horn cattle, I believe it is. So much for treating people with respect. I'll have to look at the figures again here, make sure I got them right. So the whole discipline system had broken down. They were foraging, basically, to support the army. So the two British columns meet up at Aiken's Tavern. The Americans quickly assemble a force of about 700 sharpshooters under General John Maxwell at Couch's Bridge. They hide in the woods as the British march up. Maxwell's troops really let them have it. The British force their way over the bridge. The riflemen can't stand against a bayonet charge against British regulars because the rifles aren't equipped to have bayonets attached to them, so they have no means of defending themselves once they discharge their weapon once. So Maxwell wisely pulls back. From then on, the conflict moves further north and west until eventually they fight the big battle of Brandywine on September 11th, and the Americans are defeated. After the Battle of Couch's Bridge, there was an entry that the British shipped back 9 wagons of wounded soldiers back to Elk Landing to be put on ships. On September 4, 1777, Admiral Howe pulls up anchor, and he brings the whole fleet out of the Elk River, down the Chesapeake Bay, and he'll eventually go around the Virginia Capes and up into the Delaware River to support the operations in Philadelphia. So the British don't stay here long. Following the British withdrawal, Elk Landing's back in American hands. Somewhere around the fighting in this area, Colonel Henry Hollingsworth was shot through the neck. He's sent to Wilmington to recover, and then he's transferred from active command, field command, to become commissary general of the Eastern Shore. Interesting thing about this part of the country is Cecil County, Maryland, Kent County, Delaware, Chester County, Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania are the breadbasket of the colonies. We grow more small grains here than anywhere else. We feed the American Army from this area. Following Brandywine, they fight several other battles around Philadelphia. The Battle of the Clouds, they fight Paoli. In October, Washington tries to attack the British at Germantown. He's unsuccessful in dislodging them. So he withdraws the whole army to Valley Forge for the winter. So one of the people trying to keep the American army fed at Valley Forge is Colonel Henry Hollingsworth. We all read about the starving that the American troops went through at Valley Forge. The problem was not famine. We had flour, we had food. Hollingsworth's problem is getting wagons and horses and oxen and teamsters to supply them, because the British had pretty well cleaned out the county when they came through. There wasn't a whole lot of transportation to be had. And there's a really interesting letter from Timothy Pickering, who was the acting Secretary of War for the Americans, to Hollingsworth. Somebody complained that Hollingsworth was profiteering because he was paying wagoners and ship's captains to stay with nothing to do. And they investigated, and they found that he was exonerated with a letter of good conduct from the governor of Maryland, because they realized that if he didn't keep paying the wagoners, they'd take off. So he had to keep them on the payroll to pay them to get the next load to get food up to Valley Forge. So for the remainder of the war, Elk Landing, head of Elk here, becomes an important commissary port for the American Army. I read in one reference that 1 million pounds of beef went through here during the war. Now that's on the hoof. So that's, when you think about it, a 1,000-pound animal, maybe, 1,500 cows or so over the course of 5 to 6 years. That's doable. So a very, very important commissary point here during the war. In 1780, the theater of war shifts south to the Carolinas. This is a drawing of the Battle of, a painting of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781. This is the Maryland line here. This is the 1st Maryland. The dragoons in the background are going to the rescue of the 5th Maryland, which is in the second line of troops here that was being overrun by the British. Troops here from Cecil County were involved in this battle. The 6th Maryland, which had a large contingent of troops here from Cecil County, had been folded into the 1st Maryland by this point in the war. So in April of 1781, the Marquis de Lafayette is ordered to go to Virginia. Benedict Arnold had switched sides and was now a British brigadier and was tearing up Virginia. Washington had a special dislike for Benedict Arnold, of course. He sent Lafayette an expeditionary force to see if he could capture Benedict Arnold. He was unsuccessful, but he left from Head of Elk here and came back here. Later that summer, 1781, the combined French and American army, led by the Count de Rochambeau, passed through here. The French had spent that winter of 1780 to 1781 in Newport, Rhode Island. They marched south, beginning in the spring. They met up with the American army on July 4th in Phillipsburg, New York. And then they're in Head of Elk here in September. From this point, Washington tries to reconnoiter requisition all the floating vessels he can get, anything that floats, because he wants to use the water as much as possible to quickly ferry the troops down the bay, because he's got Cornwallis bottled up on that Yorktown Peninsula. So the combined American and French force moves through this area in 1781. The French engineers drew maps of each encampment that they camped at, and there was a drawing, I haven't seen it in years, I'll see if I can locate it to incorporate into this talk, of the encampment down here at Elk Landing. And it shows the French army being encamped between the two forks of the Elk Creeks, between Big Elk and Little Elk, and the Americans up here behind, I guess, what is now the RMR building, and all going over there toward the YMCA in that area up there. But Washington used the water as much as possible because it was a much more efficient way of transporting men. The heavy siege guns had to go by land. They crossed the Susquehanna River up at Baldfriar Ferry. But it's from this point that Washington basically assembles the troops for the final campaign down there in Virginia, which culminated at the British surrender of Yorktown on October 1781. So if you come to Elk Landing now, here's what you see. This is the Hollingsworth House. It was built in approximately 1800. We don't have an actual building date to it. The archaeologist did some limited work on the front porch here. He said he can't find anything positive that would make it older than the last quarter of the 18th century, around 1800, but 1775 to 1800. It doesn't mean that the building isn't older, we just haven't found evidence of it. Originally the building was 2 stories, but in February 13th of 1848 there was a fire that destroyed the interior of the building. We have all the records from the insurance and from the rebuilding. And at that time they added the 3rd story, changed the roof line, architecture was changed to Greek Revival style, and the service wing was added at that time. So the building now doesn't look like it might have looked in colonial times, which is a shame, but it happens with old buildings, things get rebuilt. But that's the main Hollingsworth house. Also on our property is a stone house. This is a drawing, a watercolor drawing that was done in about 1909. Shows the stone house, a log cabin attached to it. There's a ship out in the creek in the background. The age of this stone building, I'll show you another shot of it here in a second, has been a matter of contention. The Swedes want to say that this was built by the Swedes back before 1700. The architect looked at it and said, no, it's American architecture, last quarter of the 18th century. So to settle the matter, I went back and forth, brought in a dendrochronologist, a man who studies tree rings from Columbia University. He drilled into the beams, the main support beams, polished them up, looked at the growth rings, matched them up to a database of other trees in the upper Chesapeake. The last year of growth on any of the beams that he studied was 1782, 1783, that winter. So we're getting a build date of that. When George Johnson, the county historian, looked at this property in the 1880s, wrote about it, he talked about a 1.5-story log house with a 2.5-story stone addition to it. So he believed that this log house was older. We have a survey plat from 1916 that shows the northwest corner, which is slightly out of the frame here, the corner, what would be the corner here, is a control point for the next property up. And the surveyor calls this building Zebulon and Hollingsworth Old Log Storehouse of 1777. How he knew that, we don't know. There is a record that the Maryland legislature appropriated money at the end of the Revolutionary War for a barrack up here made of stone or brick. This may have been originally started as that barrack, we don't know. Still have a lot of research to do. So if you come to the building, you see, this is where we took over, or come to this is what it looked like when we acquired the property. The whole roof had collapsed, there was plumbing that was hanging. And this is what we've done on it so far. Brand new roof, interiors been stabilized. These rather funny windows were done by the contractor for security. They're thick plywood, but we asked if they could put some plexiglass in to let some light in. We've just received a grant that will allow us to put real windows back in this building. I would like to rebuild personally like to see the log cabin rebuilt on the north end of it. But later this building was used for a warehouse, we believe for a tavern or source of entertainment for guests who were departing the ship, as living quarters for the captain of the schooner. His name was Vernon Biddle. So, and offices for the shipping business. So it was a multi-purpose building. So if you come to Elk Landing, you also see reenactment. There, that's the guys in Cecil County militia. That's me on that end. We do programs for schools. We are a meeting site for the Sons of the American Revolution. So we're slowly but surely building our way into becoming a living history museum. I'd like to end by saying, please come visit us. That's our brand new gate down there that we had made.
What are the hours?
Now, good question. We are an all-volunteer organization. I mean all volunteer. So we have no professional staff. Nobody answers the phone between our monthly board meetings. We're trying to get the facility open at least one Saturday a month. So if we do so, and we will post it on our website at Historic Elk Landing. Okay. Awful lot of work to be done still. The Pennsylvania Historical Society has 15,000 letters of correspondence to and from Levi Hollingsworth, who was the brother of the Hollingsworths who owned this, in Philadelphia, major flour merchant up there. We haven't even looked at those records yet. There's some more War of 1812 records from the Hollingsworth that ended up at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, of all places. There is some wonderful records, Revolutionary War records, up at the University of Rhode Island from Teamsters that came down with Rochambeau. A number of them were African American, because New Englanders believed that everybody should be educated. And these Teamsters came down, were literate, and they were absolutely appalled by the conditions of the slaves down here in the South and wrote about it. We haven't gotten a chance to examine those records. So awful lot of work to do, awful lot of information yet to be incorporated into our museum. So Washington was very, very familiar with head of elk. the name gets changed, by the way, to Elkton in 1787. He mentions head of Elk over a dozen times in his journals. He passes through here not only when he was commander-in-chief during the Revolutionary War, but also up to time and including when he was president. You know, when the capital was in Philadelphia, and then New York, he was sworn in originally. So Washington would have been very familiar with this place. One of his favorite places to stay, apparently, was here in Cecil County, Dysart's Tavern, which is also known as the Seven Stars Tavern, which is situated at the corner of Appleton Road and 273, where the high store is now. The building was torn down in the, when was it torn down, 1980s or so? There's a photograph of it in the Historical Society, but he mentions staying at Joliet Dysart's Tavern. Apparently Washington liked good lodgings and good food. But that's the connection with Washington and Elk Landing. I appreciate your time.